there just probably isn't anything better for young children than to be inspired by true accounts of people who have done great things, and in particular done great things for the glory of God. And there are a lot of stories out there to inspire young kids.
Hey Mark, it's good to see you again today.
Always.
Always good to be with you. We've had a weekend with family and children and grandchildren in my house, and it reminds me again of some of the times we spent with them reading some of the great adventure stories that kids love so much. If you can write well, if you can write with a creative imagination, you can write good adventure stories that are going to be well received in the public, because especially young adults are just always craving adventure stories, it seems to me. In my kids' generation, it's Harry Potter. And that whole series of books that came out is still so widely popular today as various kinds of adventure stories of danger and courage and breakthroughs. When my kids were young, my son's favorite story was a series called Redwall by Brian Jakes, and it's about this brave mouse and all the different battles he had. And there are actually 22 of these novels that were written. So every year we were buying more Redwall stories, and I think certainly by New Year's Day every year, they were already completely read. They were just devoured adventure stories. When I was growing up, it was C.S. Lewis' Chronicles of Narnia. Did you read those as a kid?
I grew up on those.
Did you read those?
Yep, I grew up on all of them. All of them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was a young Christian, as a teenager, those are the first things I read. I read those before I read the Bible, actually. In many ways, the Chronicles of Narnia introduced me to a lot of biblical themes. And then, of course, generations before that, there was The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And did you know that L. Frank Baum, who wrote The Wizard of Oz, actually wrote 15 Oz books? Did you know that?
I did not know that. I really didn't. I guess I had heard that it started off with books. It was not just a movie concept, but it started with books.
So I walked into an antique bookstore many years ago, and I found this very, very early edition of TikTok of Oz with great illustrations. Of course, now TikTok is really making a comeback, so I don't know what TikTok of Oz is all about yet, but
it's spelled the same way.
But the point is just wonderful, wonderful adventure stories. And I was curious about this morning, and I looked up. There are books, true adventure stories for boys, and adventure stories for girls, and adventure stories for young people. And true stories of adventure are always especially inspiring, because now you're really pointing young people toward people that are worth admiring and imitating for their faith and their courage. And there's a series that came out some years ago that now has 50 volumes in it. I wanted to point it out to you. It's called, what's it called? It's called Christian Heroes Then and Now. And I remember when these started coming out, and I think it was in the 90s. Now there's over 50 volumes, and they're true biographies of people like Elizabeth Elliot and Jim Elliot and other missionaries that went cross-culturally to bring the gospel in medicine and science and evangelism, just all to tribal countries and Africa and Indonesia and all these different places. Great adventure stories.
Yeah, and that series has been super influential. We read to our children a lot from that very series that you're mentioning. They're great for kids anywhere from like 4 or 5 years old up into their teenage years. Will still love these stories. Some of the ones that my kids thought were super influential were George Mueller was one of them. You know that's how great that story is about orphanages in England. Gladys Aylward was of course in China, so this really resonated with our kids a lot. But probably the one that was most influential as I look back on all our time was this book on Eric Liddell. Remember, he was the Olympic runner from which the movie Chariots of Fire was made. And he had such strong religious convictions that he wouldn't run in the Paris Olympics on Sunday. And therefore, he was going to set all these world records, but they set the finals for Sunday and he couldn't run on Sunday because he thought it was not the right thing to do on the Sabbath. But what people don't necessarily know is what happened to Eric after this and how he went to China as a missionary and gave his life and ended up in internment camps and
during the war.
During the war, during the first war, it was just, his story was amazing, and it changed my son David's life.
Okay.
When he was applying to college and filling out scholarship applications, he wrote about Eric Liddell, who was his role model, both as a runner. My son was a cross-country, long-distance marathon runner, and also as a missionary who went to hard places and did hard things.
Yeah. I got a few books behind me, and the largest section of books that I have is on biography. And I think it's just because biography is not just dry history of dates, but it's the stories of real people and what they went through and what motivated them and how they endured and how they overcame, or they suffered terribly, particularly in the advancement of the gospel. And I just think today, when there's so much self-absorption circling young adults, I just can't help but want to recommend these kinds of stories for our children and grandchildren, especially in the world of missions. You've had a whole life dedicated to the cause of world missions. And are there any other early influences that you had, or would you?
Yeah, when I saw that we were going to be talking about this subject, I went up to my bookshelf and pulled out probably the single most influential book for me growing up in missions was this book by Don Richardson called Peace Child.
I read that,
which is a story. Yeah, it's a story. In fact, you can see how well loved this book has been in my family. We need to go get it fixed or something, or find a new copy. But when I was 13, 14 years old, I went to a summer camp, and the lady who ran this Christian summer camp would read to us in the hottest hour or two of the day because it was just sweltering hot. And she would bring us into the shade, and she would read to us from this book, and I was transfixed by it.
Yeah.
And God probably used this book more than any other single book to reveal to me the call that he had on my life to serve.
Well, that's a capital A adventure story. I highly recommend it for anyone to pick up that book. Give us a quick biblical foundations of what it means to be a missionary. Can you do that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's a tall order to give a quick answer to that question, because it's like all of the non sequiturs, if you will, of Christianity, where the first shall be last, and the religious leaders are whitewashed tombs, and you've got all these things that almost seem Christianity and the gospel message. It's so simple, and yet the depths of theological richness could never be plumbed by the greatest intellectual minds of the world. And missions is the same way. The concept of missions is really quite simple in that Jesus came to save sinners, not just the Jewish nation, which is what you would have maybe gotten if you only read the Old Testament. But there is a whole world of missiology, the study of missions. I'm not a missiologist, but I have delved into studying missions as a discipline, as a theological discipline, as I know you have too. And there's just so much there. But I would boil it down, John, this way. And I think that the most influential thing for me was when I understood the place of Abram or Abraham in the Old Testament in Genesis chapter 12, and when God called him and told him that he was going to use Abram and his offspring to bless the world. Abraham became the father of Isaac and Jacob, and then the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, who became the Hebrew nation. And God was always blessing the Hebrews so that he could show other people who he was as a loving God. And when the people of Israel went off track, he disciplined them in very visible ways so that the world could say, there's a God acting on behalf of Israel, and they are disobeying him, and now they're suffering the consequences, or they're obeying him and he is blessing them. In other words, it was always about other people outside of the Israelite nation knowing the character and the love and eventually the salvation of God. And all of that became more clear in the New Testament when Jesus came and began to teach and then lived and died and resurrected. Missions is really the whole story of Christ in us. Christ in us, changing us from the inside out so that we can show both with our lives and what we talk about, how we live and the decisions that we make, we can show to an unknowing world, a lost and broken world, what it means to be restored to the Father. It's a beautiful thing. And it's all throughout the Bible, from the first pages of Scripture all the way through to Revelation.
So Abraham became a missionary in a sense. Paul, and it's been going on ever since. In modern times, we talk about frontier or pioneer missions, meaning going into a place where there are no believers or less than 2% of the population being believers. And really introducing the gospel for the first time. I know about a third of the world is still defined that way as an unreached people group. But you went to one personally, and worked in this arena called Frontier Missions. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, the Lord called us early on to go, and it was sort of the Pauline calling of not really wanting to build on someone else's foundation. We could work in the United States, and there's total validity in doing that. But, the United States is one of the most Christianized places on the planet. And our calling, we felt like, was that God was asking us to go to places where Christ had really not been named. And there are, millions of people on the face of this planet, hundreds of millions of people, even with the internet, even with jet planes, even with cell phones. There are hundreds of millions of people who have no concept about Jesus and his death and burial and resurrection. They don't know any Christians. They've never met a Christian. They've never been to church. They've never read the Bible because they don't necessarily maybe even have access to it. We wanted to go to a place where the Lord would use us to introduce Jesus to a people who did not know him.
And where was that?
So we were in Western China, among Tibetan people groups up in the Himalayan mountains. For 10 years we lived there, raised our kids there.
So here's a picture of you and your family up in the Tibetan highlands. I'm always intrigued by this picture. I know this is not your everyday wearing clothes. It's probably more of a ceremonial day. But it immediately, for someone like me who's never been in that situation, it immediately speaks of the radical change from the world that you know to the world that you went to. Can you share with us?
We had this clothing, and we wore it from time to time, but it was usually to festivals and horse races and ceremonies and things like that. So we did dress like Tibetans sometimes, but not all the time. But the picture it makes people stop and realize how different cultures and peoples across the world can be and are from the familiarity of the American culture.
So what did you find there? I mean, did you just go there and you just start saying, I want to tell you about Jesus Christ? And they said, this is wonderful. This is good news. I'm going to receive it. I mean, how does it actually work?
Yeah, it's interesting, John. The idea of doing missions and ministry among an unreached people group, I think, is actually one of the most absurd concepts on the face of the planet. And I'll go ahead and spoil the end of this story is that it's absurd outside of the power and the access that we have to the divine power of Jesus and God working through us. If you were to say that you were going to go start churches among an unreached people group, it really would sound absurd, especially if you began to kind of back up in your mind and think about what it means to go to an unreached area where they may or may not have a concept of sin, whereas these Tibetans didn't. They may or may not have a concept of a supreme God at all. They have many, many gods in their pantheon, but the missionaries would talk about Allah na me bi gom chokalach, the most high God above whom there is no other. And these Tibetans would say, well, I don't know who that God is, but evidently he's the most supreme of all the gods that I know so far. And we would be this idea that you're gonna go and you're gonna learn people's languages, you're gonna live among them, get access to them, and then in our case, the written language and the spoken language were different. So what you wrote on the page you couldn't say, and what you said you couldn't write down and pass a note to somebody. So there was almost like this multiple language thing going on.
So you had to learn.
I know that's.
You had to learn Chinese, and then you had to learn Tibetan, and then you had to learn the difference between the written Tibetan and the spoken Tibetan.
That's right. And there are a couple other things that we had to learn language-wise, but that pretty much covers it. But then the idea that you're going to get so proficient in knowing their language and their culture that you can begin to explain to them after you've built these trusting relationships that there has always been a supreme God who has wanted to know them and reveal himself to them. And finally, he's now here to do that. He's going to reveal himself to you, and you have to explain that they've transgressed his moral law and that he's angry with them, and yet he sent his son, Jesus Christ, to die on a cross. And they're thinking, okay, son, what's God doing up in heaven to have a son? That doesn't sound very much like one of the gods that we know. And you say, oh, no, he's a triune God. Here, there are actually three of them. They're thinking, okay, well, maybe this is a lot like my own religion. And you're trying to explain, but they're one. And God made this path for you to take on an appropriate righteousness with Jesus through his atonement and his substitutionary death and on the cross. And then your idea is that they're going to learn this and they're going to embrace this and they're going to understand biblical concepts and truth and then start growing in their faith. Just seems absurd.
I can feel the mountains of obstacles that you have to overcome already, just in you telling us that. Things that we, even in a nominal Christian world, we understand something about the Trinity and the Son of God, and we have that understanding, but you're starting really from scratch. When we get back from our break here, I want to ask you a few questions about how you overcame some of those things and what some of the breakthroughs were by the power of God. So let's do that.
The U.S. accounts for only 3% of the abortions that happen in our world each year, leaving 97% of the crisis before us as a world missions challenge. Would you join us in serving where the need is greatest? PassionLife, rescuing the most vulnerable where abortion is most concentrated.
So Mark, most of my work in world missions, and I've been to 25, 35 countries, but it's not in this frontier kind of missions that you were involved in. It's really was going to work, for example, in Vietnam. You're working with Christians in Vietnam and you're equipping them to reach more and more of their own people or some of the people groups that are within Vietnam. And that's the work mainly of PassionLife all over the world, is to go in and train an existing church cross-culturally about the sanctity of human life and about how rescuing the innocent is a way to show the love and the power of Jesus Christ and help people to trust him for their daily bread and a new life. And so it's not the same kind of missions that you were involved in, where you were starting with absolutely ground zero with the people that you were serving, with insurmountable obstacles. So tell us a little bit about some of the either additional hardships or the crack in the walls, or how it broke in and started to make changes in lives there.
Yeah. There are additional considerations in missions when you've got language and culture and unfamiliarity, but at the same time, the basic need in all of humanity is the same. We need salvation, whether we're aware of it or not. And one of the tricks for anyone who's sharing the gospel, whether it be just doing evangelism in your neighborhood or doing overseas cross-cultural missions, is to help uncover this felt need for God to come into their life and for them to submit themselves to the Lordship of Christ. And that's one thing that's common everywhere we go. And it's not an easy thing when you have the additional considerations when you're on the mission field. You have to learn to find these keys, if you will. And some people in missions history have talked about God revealing these keys for their culture to be able to understand that God was always there for them and was seeking to reveal himself to those people. So we had trouble finding some of those keys, and it takes time. But I will say that one of the things that we uncovered along the way was that a common area of brokenness and anxiety and heartbreak for the Tibetan people that we were living among surrounded pregnancy.
Really?
And what I mean by that is this was during the time of the one-child policy of China, and the idea that you could have a baby or have a baby that was born and not survive was a tremendous anxiety for these people. There was a very high infant mortality rate.
Okay.
Once you have that one child, if you've had a child at a hospital, they may or may not sterilize you in those old days so that you can't have any more children. And then the infant mortality rate was also very high. Before the age of 5, I think it was just very, very high in our area. Okay. So the Lord used that as a means for us to establish a ministry that ministered to families who were having babies, women in high-risk pregnancies, women in crisis pregnancies who were also thinking about abortion, to be able to talk to those women about the implications of abortion, which obviously was an entree to my coming on with PassionLife and doing more of what I do now. But we established an NGO of sorts that really ministered to families who were in high-risk pregnancies, and even did things post-birth, neonatal, if you will. Some classes, provided ambulatory care, provided education, provided some small things to help enhance the survival rate of young children in that harsh environment. So that was kind of one of the breakthroughs that we experienced.
So that kind of pulled down their defenses and made wanting to know you an important part of their life, because you were instrumental in helping their babies survive. Then that's what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, again, that's an entry point to help build a relationship with people around an area of felt need. If you've got all this anxiety around having a baby and making sure that this one baby lives and thrives, and you've got someone who can help you navigate through that time, it's easy to build a trusting relationship. And then I've earned the authority and the right to speak into their lives on other issues as well, because now they respect me for who I am. So I think that's a kind of a common missiological practice. That's why we have medical missions to begin with.
There's no doubt about it. Everybody gets sick, like you say. It's an entry point that's universal. So the language is different, the clothes are different, our thinking styles are different, but everybody gets sick. and everybody wants their kids to survive, and they want to survive. So medical missions was a way to show that God is a God of love, a God of healing. Plus, think of the relationship it was creating between you and the people that you were helping with their babies and stuff. So I can get
much ado has been made of strategies for church planting and missions. And there are people who write books and volumes on church planting strategy. I don't discount any of that, but if I were to write a book on missions strategy, the strategies that I would write about would probably be different than what a lot of people would write about. I would write about tears, because I've never seen church planting happen without people investing themselves and crying tears of frustration and tears of worry and tears of defeat and tears on the other side of victory and happiness and joy. Paul cried many tears, as he recorded in the New Testament as a church planter. Tears would be a mission strategy for me. Perseverance would be a mission strategy for me. Sometimes it takes just digging in and holding your ground and not taking no for an answer.
Wow.
That's a mission strategy that probably wouldn't be on many top 10 lists. There are several of those in our lives that I think one other mission strategy for us that I would highly endorse and recommend is weakness. Letting people see that just because your God is strong doesn't mean you're perfect, but when they see your humanity and they see that you need them to be able to live in this foreign culture, in this exotic land, or else you're going to wear yourself out and burn yourself out and quit and go home. And then you need those local people to come alongside you and be your friends, teach you how to slaughter a lamb and make fire out of yak dung and how to make that catch coal on fire and the kinds of things that we had to learn.
Yeah. Wow.
Our weakness, I think, was one of the things that really endeared us to the people that we were trying to minister to.
So over the years that you were there, I know that most of the time you're just letting people see Christ in you. As you've mentioned to me before, Christ in you is the hope of glory. What I know the story's not really over. Okay, I know that, but kind of tell us how did God use that willingness to go in order to bring
I'll
Christ
summarize, John.
Yeah.
I'll summarize and just say that breakthrough came at the most unexpected time for us. It was actually when the Lord was leading us out of the countryside location where we were and bringing us back to the city that the church began to emerge. And it was not exactly what we thought it was going to look like, but we learned to join God in his mission rather than forcing him to do it our way. The first converts were blind and lame and illiterate and poor. And it was a total mess, but it was perfect if you think about it. From God's perspective, it was a beautiful thing, and the church is still growing there now.
And the church is still growing there. That is a great adventure, and I just my heart just rejoices. I just want to say, kids are so depressed these days, and so focused on social media and so on. And if you care about your kids or your grandkids, I'm just telling you, get them thinking outside, thinking adventure, thinking mission, getting biographies going, finding out what God can do through everyday people like you, Mark, and your wife and family. It's very, very exciting. And I think it's the antidote to our times here in the U.S. is to live big and to go off and do hard things in hard places. Thanks a lot for being with us today, Mark.